Weston Grayson barely noticed the train's screeching halt as he stood near the door, scrolling through endless emails on his phone. His mind was consumed with work, another acquisition, another deal, another billion-dollar decision. The packed train was an unusual setting for him, but his car had broken down, and taking the train seemed more efficient than waiting for his driver. He barely looked up until he heard a soft sigh. "Excuse me," a woman murmured, shifting uncomfortably as she clutched a bulky messenger bag against her chest. Weston's gaze flickered up, immediately drawn to the woman standing just a few feet away. She was gripping a pole, her knuckles white from holding on so tightly. The train lurched, and she stumbled slightly, catching herself just in time. Without thinking, he stood. "Take my seat." She blinked at him, startled. "Oh no, couldn't." "Take it," he repeated, his voice firm but not unkind. For a moment, she hesitated, studying him. Then, giving him a grateful smile, she slid into the seat. "Thank you, that's really kind of you." Weston nodded, but as he gripped the overhead handle for balance, he found himself watching her. She had deep brown eyes, framed by long lashes, and a warmth about her that made the crowded train feel a little less suffocating. Her dark, curly hair was pulled into a loose bun, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She looked up after a moment, catching him staring. "I'm Odette," she said, offering a small smile. "Weston." "Well, Weston, I owe you one." He shrugged. "It's just a seat." But something about her made him feel like it wasn't just that. The train rumbled forward, and they fell into an easy silence. Odette pulled out a notebook, flipping through pages filled with scribbled notes and sketches. Weston tried to focus on his phone, but he kept glancing at her, curiosity gnawing at him. "What do you do?" he asked finally, surprising himself. He never started conversations with strangers, especially not on a train. Odette looked up, a little surprised. "I'm a designer. Well, trying to be one. I do freelance work, but I'm hoping to land something more stable soon." "A designer?" Weston raised an eyebrow. "Fashion." "Interior," she corrected with a grin. "Though, if you saw my apartment, you wouldn't believe it. It's more of a work in progress than an actual home." He chuckled, and the sound felt foreign to him. When was the last time he laughed at something that wasn't business-related? The train jolted again, and she reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing against his arm. The touch was fleeting, barely there, but Weston felt it like a spark. The next stop was announced, and Odette sighed. "That's me." She stood, adjusting the strap of her bag. "Thanks again for the seat, Weston, and for the conversation." Before he could think, before he could stop himself, he said, "Let me buy you coffee sometime." Odette paused, tilting her head. "Are you sure you don't just feel guilty about making me take your seat?" He chuckled, "Maybe." She studied him for a second, then nodded. "All right, coffee." She scribbled her number on a scrap of paper and handed it to him just as the doors slid open. "Don't lose it," she teased before stepping off the train. Weston watched her disappear into the crowd, the piece of paper burning in his palm. He didn't expect to think about her again. And yet, for days after, he did. Weston stared at the number on the scrap of paper for days. It sat on his desk, taunting him between meetings, acquisitions, and the endless stream of decisions that dictated his life. He had no reason to hesitate. He wasn't the kind of man who second-guessed himself. Yet, something about Odette made him pause. On the fourth day, he finally dialed. The phone rang twice before she picked up, her voice light and teasing. "I was starting to think you lost my number." "I don't lose things," he replied smoothly. "I just take my time deciding what's worth keeping." A brief silence, then a soft laugh, and I made the cut. "Let's find out." They agreed to meet at a cafe in the Arts District, a place she suggested with an enthusiasm that made him curious. It wasn't the sleek, high-end spots he was used to, but an eclectic, plant-filled space with mismatched furniture and the scent of fresh pastries lingering in the air. When he arrived, Odette was already there, flipping through a design magazine with an expression of deep concentration. She glanced up as he approached, a slow smile forming. "You actually showed. You sound surprised." "I figured a man in a suit like that doesn't frequent places like this." He glanced down at himself. The tailored charcoal suit was second nature, a part of his identity. "You'd be right." "And yet, here you are," she mused, gesturing to the seat across from her. He took it, watching as she pushed a menu toward him. "You have to try the almond croissants. Life-changing." Weston arched a brow. "Life-changing." "Trust me." He ordered one, along with a black coffee, while she sipped something that smelled like cinnamon and honey. They fell into conversation easily, the usual small talk melting into something more layered. She spoke about design with a passion that was almost infectious, her hands moving as she described the way spaces could shift moods, tell stories. "People underestimate how much their environment affects them," she said, tapping a fingertip against the rim of her cup. "A sterile, cold space can drain you, but the right design, it can make you feel alive." Weston found himself listening more intently than he had in years. "And what does your space say about you?" She laughed, shaking her head. "That I'm a work in progress, but so is everyone, right?" He wasn't sure why, but that statement settled into him, a truth he hadn't considered before. Their food arrived, and Odette watched as he took his first bite of the croissant, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Well." He chewed thoughtfully, then nodded. "Not bad." She gasped in mock offense. "Not bad, that was not the reaction I was expecting." He leaned back, watching her with amusement. "I don't hand out compliments easily." She shook her head, muttering something about impossible men, but there was laughter in her eyes. The conversation continued, flowing effortlessly. She had a way of speaking that was unfiltered, refreshingly real. She challenged him, teased him, but never in a way that felt forced. It was easy, and Weston didn't do easy. An hour passed before he finally checked his watch, surprised at how fast time had slipped away. Odette noticed, "Important meeting." "Something like that." He hesitated, then met her gaze. "I'd like to see you again." She studied him for a moment, lips pressing together in thought. "All right," she said slowly, "but next time I pick the place again." "Deal." As he walked away, he realized something unsettling. For the first time in a long time, something outside of work had his full attention. Weston hadn't realized how much he looked forward to their next meeting until he found himself checking the time repeatedly that evening. Odette had chosen a rooftop bar in the city, not one of the exclusive, members-only lounges he usually frequented, but a lively, open-air space where string lights crisscrossed the sky and a jazz band played in the corner. It was the kind of place filled with energy, laughter, and an easygoing charm that felt entirely hers. She was already there when he arrived, leaning against the bar with a glass of something amber-colored in her hand. When she spotted him, she lifted it in greeting. "I was starting to think you lived in that suit," she teased, eyeing his slightly more relaxed attire, a crisp white dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up and dark slacks. "I do," he quipped, "but I make exceptions." Odette grinned and gestured for him to sit beside her. "Good. I'd hate to think you were incapable of adjusting to the environment." He ordered a drink, then turned his attention to her. The city lights reflected in her dark eyes, making them seem even warmer than he remembered. "You picked an interesting place." She shrugged. "I like places with character. This one has history. The owner built it from the ground up, putting his entire savings into it. Now it's one of the most popular rooftops in the city, feels like a good place to have a conversation." Weston found himself appreciating the way she viewed the world. Where others saw a bar, she saw a story. As the evening unfolded, their conversation deepened. Odette spoke about her struggles breaking into the design world, how difficult it was to find clients willing to take a chance on someone relatively unknown. She didn't complain, though she simply stated it as fact, as if she had already accepted the challenge and would eventually conquer it. People like safe choices, she mused, swirling the ice in her glass. They pick designers with flashy portfolios, big names. I get it, but also know that good design isn't about reputation, it's about understanding people, and that's something I'm good at. Weston watched her, impressed by her quiet determination. You don't let rejection discourage you. Oh, I do, she admitted with a small laugh. I just don't let it stop me. There was something magnetic about the way she carried herself, not in an overtly confident way, but in the way she seemed completely at ease with who she was. What about you? She asked, tilting her head. I feel like I still don't know much about Weston Grayson beyond the fact that he gives up train seats and wears very expensive suits. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. I run a company. A vague. A successful company. Even vaguer. He considered her for a moment, then relented. Real estate, development, acquisitions. I buy buildings, land, businesses turn them into something more. Odette's eyes lit with understanding. So you don't just build spaces, you change them. He hadn't thought about it that way before. I suppose you could say that. She leaned forward slightly. And do you love it? The question caught him off guard. People usually asked about numbers, profits, strategies, not whether he loved what he did. It's what I'm good at, he said after a pause. Odette studied him, then nodded as if she understood something he hadn't said aloud. She didn't press further, but the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was thoughtful. A breeze swept through the rooftop, carrying the sound of the city with it. For a moment, neither of them spoke, content in the space they had created between them. Then Odette smirked. So, tell me, how does a man like you end up on a train? Don't you have a fleet of black cars waiting to whisk you away at all times? Weston chuckled, shaking his head. Bad timing. My usual driver was unavailable and my car decided to die on me. The train was the fastest option. And fate intervened, she said dramatically, raising her glass in mock celebration. He lifted his own in response. Something like that. They clinked their glasses together, and as the night wore on, Weston realized something surprising. He wasn't thinking about work. He wasn't strategizing, planning his next move, or mentally running through his schedule. He was simply enjoying her. And that was new. Weston had never been the kind of man to let distractions take hold of him. His life was structured, precise, built on a foundation of calculated decisions and strategic moves. And yet, Odette had slipped into his world with an ease that defied all logic. It had been weeks since their rooftop evening, and instead of fading into a passing encounter, she had become something he anticipated. Their conversations stretched into late nights, their meetings evolving beyond casual coffee dates into something deeper, something neither of them openly labeled but both undeniably felt. Now, as he stood outside her apartment, a charming pre-war building with ivy creeping up the stone facade, Weston found himself in unfamiliar territory. He wasn't here to negotiate a deal or secure an investment. He was here because he wanted to be. Because the thought of an evening without her had started to feel like a wasted one. Odette opened the door with a paintbrush still in her hand, a small streak of soft blue smudged across her cheek. Her hair was piled on top of her head in a way that seemed haphazard but suited her perfectly. She tilted her head at him, amused. Weston Grayson, at my doorstep, she mused. Did I forget we had plans? No, he said, stepping inside as she moved aside to let him in. "I just wanted to see you." Her expression softened, surprise flickering across her features before she smiled. "Well, in that case, welcome to the chaos." The chaos was her living room, where half-painted canvases leaned against the walls, fabric swatches were spread across the coffee table, and an open notebook with rough sketches sat beside a cup of tea long gone cold. It was a space brimming with creativity, with life so different from the pristine, curated environments he was used to. She set the brush down and wiped her hands on an old cloth. "I was testing out colors for a client," she explained, nodding toward the canvas. "But I got a little carried away." Weston stepped closer, eyeing the swirls of muted blues and deep grays. "You painted this." "More like experimented," she corrected, watching him. "What do you think?" He took his time, studying the movement of the brushstrokes, the way the colors blended and clashed in certain places. "It's bold," he finally said. Odette let out a breathless laugh. "That's code for, I don't know what I'm looking at, isn't it?" He turned to her, his gaze steady. "No, it means it makes an impression." Something flickered in her eyes at that, something unspoken. She didn't look away, neither did he. The air between them shifted, subtle but undeniable. "You surprise me, Weston," she murmured. He reached up, brushing his thumb lightly over the streak of paint on her cheek. "You do the same to me." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, as if pulled by an invisible force, she leaned in. The kiss was slow, unhurried, like both of them were figuring out something neither had planned for. When they pulled back, Odette searched his face, as if waiting for him to say something that would make sense of what had just happened. Weston exhaled, his hand still resting against her cheek. "I wasn't expecting you," he admitted, "but I don't want this to be temporary." She studied him, her fingers brushing against the front of his shirt. "Neither do I." And just like that, without any grand declaration or carefully calculated move, something between them shifted into permanence. Weston wasn't used to distractions, but Odette had become an undeniable presence in his life. Meetings that once held his full attention now felt like obligations he had to get through before he could see her again. His world, once defined by deals and acquisitions, now had a new center, and it was her. That realization hit him one evening as he stood in his penthouse, staring at the untouched dinner his housekeeper had left for him. Normally, he'd eat while reviewing reports or finalizing contracts. But tonight, all he could think about was how quiet the space felt, how much he wanted Odette to be there instead. Without hesitating, he grabbed his keys and left. When he arrived at her building, he found her sitting on the front steps, sketchbook in hand. She looked up as he approached, amusement flickering across her face. "Didn't expect to see you here," she said, closing the notebook. "I didn't expect to be here," he admitted, taking the spot beside her. Odette studied him, as if trying to decipher what had brought him to her doorstep. Rough day in the Empire. He huffed a quiet laugh, something like that. She nudged him lightly. "Tell me." Weston hesitated. He wasn't the kind of man who shared his thoughts easily, but with her, it felt different. It felt necessary. "I closed a deal today," he finally said. "A major acquisition, the kind of thing that would have consumed me a year ago." Odette tilted her head, waiting. "But all I could think about was you," he admitted, "and how none of it feels quite as important as it used to." She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she placed her hand over his, grounding him in the moment. "That's not a bad thing, Weston." He turned his hand, threading his fingers through hers. "It's unfamiliar." Odette gave him a knowing look. Maybe unfamiliar isn't always bad. He exhaled, the tension he hadn't realized he was carrying easing at her words. For a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the city buzzing around them. Then, Odette squeezed his hand. "Come inside," she said softly. "Stay for a while." And for the first time in his life, Weston Grayson chose something that wasn't planned. He chose her. Weston had never been a man who second-guessed his decisions. Yet, as he stepped into Odette's apartment that evening, he realized he was navigating unfamiliar territory not in business, but in something far more unpredictable. Her space was different from anywhere he had ever spent time. The walls were lined with shelves overflowing with books and trinkets that told a story of a life lived with passion rather than precision. A half-finished mood board leaned against a chair, swatches of fabric pinned to it in a chaotic yet deliberate arrangement. The scent of vanilla and something floral lingered in the air, grounding him in her world. Odette set her sketchbook on a side table and turned to face him, her expression softer than usual. "You look like someone who isn't used to just showing up somewhere without a plan." He let out a short breath. "That obvious?" She leaned against the edge of her couch, studying him with a quiet intensity. "A little." Weston loosened his tie, something he rarely did outside of his own home. "I wasn't sure if I should come." "But you did." He met her gaze. "I did." Something in her expression shifted, as though she understood the weight of what he wasn't saying. Without another word, she moved toward the kitchen, pulling open a cabinet and retrieving 2 glasses. "Well, since you're here, I think that calls for wine." He followed her movements, watching as she poured a deep red liquid into each glass. She handed him one, her fingers brushing his briefly. They settled on the couch, the city lights outside casting a soft glow through the window. Odette curled her legs beneath her, turning to face him. "Tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with your work." Weston hesitated. No one had ever asked him that before. His career had always been the defining aspect of his life. "I used to play the piano," he said finally. Her brows lifted. "Really?" He nodded. "My mother insisted on lessons when I was a kid. I hated it at first, but eventually, I started to enjoy it." Odette tilted her head. "Do you still play?" "No," he admitted. "Haven't in years." She studied him for a beat before speaking. "You should." Weston's lips quirked slightly. "You always this persistent?" "Only when I care about something," she said simply. The words settled between them, carrying more weight than the casual way she had spoken them suggested. He reached out, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. She didn't pull away. "I don't think I realized how much I was missing until I met you," he said quietly. Odette's breath hitched just slightly, her fingers tightening around her glass. "That's a dangerous thing to say, Weston." He shook his head. "It's the truth." She looked down for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts, then met his gaze again. "I don't want to be something temporary in your life." "You're not," he said without hesitation. A flicker of emotion crossed her face, something unreadable but undeniably real. She set her glass down on the table and leaned closer. "Then, don't disappear." Weston reached for her, his hand resting against the curve of her jaw. "I won't." And then, without hesitation, he kissed her. There was nothing uncertain about it, no hesitation, no second-guessing. It was a promise, a declaration, a step into something neither of them had planned but both knew was inevitable. When they finally pulled apart, Odette rested her forehead against his, her breath warm against his skin. "You're going to change my life, aren't you?" she whispered. Weston ran his thumb over her cheek, his voice steady. "I think you've already changed mine." And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of where it would lead.